Hello, I am Daniel Hannan. I am a British Conservative member of the House of Lords, and I'm also the president of the Institute for Free Trade. And I'm here to take on some of the more common misconceptions about trade and tariffs.
Let's run through some of the other claims that are out there now. Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent has said that tariffs create leverage to negotiate with other countries.
There are three arguments that the administration is making for tariffs. Number one, they bring in revenue, and this is going to let us cut the income tax. Number two, they're reshoring jobs, they're bringing manufacturing back to America. Number three, the one you just heard, they're a negotiating tactic to break open other countries and bring about a zero tariff world. Now, I actually think that every single one of those arguments is wrong. They don't bring in revenue. The amount of revenue they bring in is nugatory compared to other taxes. They do not reshore jobs. They destroy jobs. They make the industries that they supposedly protect flabby, inefficient, and dependent on the state. And they are a terrible negotiating tool because the reciprocal tariffs that were brought in by other countries in 2018 are all still in place, right? So I think all of those arguments are false. I don't expect the convinced protectionist to believe me. But I would appeal to your sense of logic when I say this. If one of those three arguments is true, then by definition, the other two cannot be true, right? Because the three of them are completely incompatible. If tariffs are raising revenue, it's because lots of goods are still crossing the border, so they're not reshoring any jobs. If they're reshoring jobs, they're not bringing in any revenue. And if they are a negotiating tool, if they're just about getting leverage, then by definition, they're not doing either of the others. So can we at least accept the most basic rule of logic that X and not X cannot be simultaneously true?
The White House says that U.S. manufacturing output as a share of global manufacturing output was 17.4%, down from 28.4%. Should we care about that?
Show me a country that wholly relies on manufacturing, and I will show you a poor developing country. You move from agriculture, then to manufacturing, and then to services. And with each of those moves, you get richer, you work shorter hours, and you live better. And yet, every one of those moves is howled down as the end of employment and the end of civilization, right? When we developed agricultural machinery that meant that a small number of men could now grow all the food they needed, there was a terror that this would mean armies of vagabonds, of sturdy beggars was the phrase that they used at the time, rampaging across the countryside because everybody knew that the only real job was on the land and that there were these so-called manufactories were never going to employ enough people. But of course they did, and we lived better than ever. It's the central fact of our life, the Industrial Revolution. Then, when we move from manufacturing to services, exactly the same thing. Oh, there's not going to be enough jobs. What are they all going to be doing? Cutting each other's hair, flipping burgers. And yet, more and more people are working, doing better and better things. Now we have the same fears about AI and robotics. The one absolute constant here is that our standards of living improve as we specialize and move up the production chain.
Energy Secretary Chris Wright, for example, has said that tariffs will lower energy prices and inspire more investment in America.
Tariffs are a tax on consumers. So the one thing they absolutely are not going to do is lower prices. There is a diverse energy mix in this, as in any other country, and every sector in the energy industry relies on some imported components, right? Whether it's renewables, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear. There is no way that energy prices will fall other than by buying the cheapest energy, right, from wherever it is. And by the way, I think I'm right in saying that the deficit with Canada that so exercises this administration is entirely made up in oil, right? So the idea that forcing Canada, if you like, back into a position of net neutrality on the trade balance, the idea that could be achieved without a rise in energy costs in the US, I hope everyone can see that just cannot be true.
The Trump administration also says that from 1997 to 2024, the U.S. lost around 5 million manufacturing jobs and experienced one of the largest drops in manufacturing employment in history. Is losing 5 million jobs over 27 years something we should be freaking out about?
More Americans are working than at any point in history. So yes, some jobs are obsolete and some new jobs get created. And the move from heavy industry has been happening since at least the Second World War, right? And what you've got to ask yourself is it intrinsically worse to move from bashing metal for a living to, say, operating a camera, right? What's the loss to the individual of no longer doing these brutalizing jobs? My maternal grandfather was a shipyard worker in the west of Scotland. And he had the typical unhealthy west of Scotland lifestyle. He smoked very heavily. He died when he was, I think, 61. So I never met him. So I never got the chance to ask him whether he would have wanted to keep that industry going at whatever cost in subsidy in order to preserve that way of life. But if he could see what my cousins and I do for a living, I have a pretty shrewd idea that he would be glad that we moved on. And I have to say, when I look at the people who rhapsodize most about jobs in heavy industry, it's not jobs that they want to do themselves. Robert Lighthizer was a lobbyist. Donald Trump inherited a real estate business. Navarro was an academic, right? They're not telling their sons to become coal miners, right? So there is an easy romanticization that happens when you're sitting in a comfortable chair as a commentator or a politician. The people in those jobs, like my late grandfather, in general, they don't want their kids to do the same kind of brutalizing work that they did if a machine can do it for us and release everyone else to easier, more productive, and better paid jobs.
Trump's also said that the reciprocal tariffs are necessary because other countries are ripping us off. Is trade with other countries ripping off the United States of America?
No, it is true that other countries have tariffs, and they are very foolish to do so because those tariffs will mainly hurt them. And I can't stress this point too strongly. It's a counterintuitive point, and therefore I think that the biggest difference between economists and non-economists is on this. Most people intuitively think that the great advantage of trade is exporting stuff, whereas most economists will tell you that no, the real advantage is getting cheaper stuff, cheaper imports, which means that you've then got more leisure time or more spending power, which you spend, and you use that to spend your money on everything else, and that's what drives growth, right? So because of that misunderstanding, people tend to think that producing more and exporting more is what makes you rich, and therefore if you're keeping out foreign produce, that is helping you. It's not. It's impoverishing you. Yes, it is doing incidental damage to other countries' exporters. It's hurting them too, but the main damage is to you. And this is why there was a very left-wing British economist called Joan Robinson in the 30s who said that if another country drops rocks in its harbours, you don't respond by dropping rocks in your own harbours. And when people say, okay, you so-called economists, if tariffs are so bad, why do other countries do it? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, political reasons why it happens. Politicians often do irrational things in the national interest that are rational from their own electoral interest, right? It often happens that because tariffs bring concentrated gains and dispersed losses, a tariff might help you win a particular constituency, even though it is always and everywhere damaging to your country as a whole. So there's a whole bunch of bad reasons why other countries make this mistake. But just because somebody else is shooting himself in the foot, the worst possible response is to take aim and blow off a couple of your own toes in order to show them.
We've also heard Energy Secretary Chris Wright say that tariffs will increase American exports. To the point you just made, do you expect that to happen?
There's something really important to understand here. There's a reason we call it a trade balance. Deficit in trade will be matched by a surplus in investment, or vice versa. That's how it works. So there's a certain amount of dollars in the world. A foreigner holding US dollars can do one of two things with those dollars. They can either buy American exports, or they can buy something in the US. They can invest in this country, invest in plant here, or in a business here, or whatever. Now, one of the reasons why the US has had a deficit for a long time is because it is very attractive to invest in this country, because the growth has been substantially higher than Europe or other developed economies, right? And that is a good thing. It's creating jobs, and it's creating wealth here in the US. You can't have this both ways, right? If the trade goes back into balance, then there would be a lot less investment here. People who think that the deficit is unsustainable, we can't carry on with it, and so on. Do you know, when was the US last in surplus? The trade balance of this country was last in surplus in 1975. If you're old enough to remember 1975, I hope that you can acknowledge, at the very least, that we are living better than we did in 1975, right? That we no longer have just 3 channels on TV, no wiki, no Wi-Fi, no cheap flights, terrible watery coffee, etc., etc., etc. Right? A stationary car in 1975 emitted more pollution than a car moving at full speed today. Life has got better and better. Life expectancy, hours worked, healthcare outcomes, you name it. And I say that because I cannot stress this enough. No one has ever managed to establish a serious correlation between a country's trade balance and its growth rate. Trade balances really don't matter.
If you buy American-made products, you shouldn't worry about Trump's tariffs because they won't affect you.
Half of the imports into the US, more or less half, are in the form of component parts, which is why the American Manufacturers Association is so against the tariff regimes or the tariff schedules that were announced a week or so before I recorded this interview, right? The idea that you can distinguish between American-made products and foreign products is really not that simple. What we can say for sure is that tariffs will push up the cost, not only of the imported stuff, obviously with the tariff, but also that the domestic industries will raise their prices as well because they no longer have the competition. And what does that mean? It means that every American has less disposable income. They've all got to spend more money to live at the same level that they were living at before without any gain, right? Purely because of the tariffs. What does that mean? It means they've got less money to spend on everything else, which is why you will get a recession.
Fatih Ungün says that tariffs will reverse the crisis in masculinity.
Let's leave aside whether there really is a crisis of masculinity in the United States. For the sake of argument, if there were, do we really think that politicians and bureaucrats are the right people to solve it? That a different economic system is going overnight to make Americans more manly? And just while on the subject of what governments can do and what they can't do, when did governments become so wise? This is a question that I'd really put to all the mercantilists out there. One of the things, we've all heard it, every one of us who's a free trade advocate, people say, oh, you live in this imaginary perfect world, this rational world where human beings always behave in a completely logical way, and real life isn't like that, and in the real world Now, it's not just that that's not true. I mean, no free marketeer thinks that human beings act rationally. There's a whole discipline of economics explaining why they behave irrationally in predictable ways. But what's the real utopianism here? It's imagining that somehow governments will behave in the national interest in this disinterested, patriotic way, suddenly immune to any kind of lobbying, any kind of special interest, right? That they will somehow pick the industries that need protection in this wise and neutral way. That they won't be influenced by whose district has the most powerful lobby, or which industry has the most powerful labor unions and the biggest political connections. And that they will exercise this wisdom and this neutrality in the interest of the nation as a whole. Now, what is there in any field of government activity that makes you think that politicians have that wisdom?
Lord Daniel Hannan, we've heard you debunk a series of arguments for tariffs. Now, if you can, make your best succinct argument for why free trade is best.
There's a moral argument. You want to sell me something? I want to buy it. By what right does a government come between us and declare our contract illegal? Now, there may be some very, very special cases where that would need to happen. But you being in a different country from me, that is nowhere near the threshold. So there is a fundamental moral argument. There is also a practical argument. No country that practices free trade fails to get richer over time. It always and everywhere works, and it is always and everywhere unpopular, precisely because it runs up against instincts and intuitions that are buried deep in our genome. Exactly 200 years have passed since the great poet, Indian administrator and Whig politician in Britain, Lord Macaulay, said free trade, the greatest gift that a government can bestow upon a people, is in almost every country unpopular. Said that in 1824. Between 1824 and now, the human race has suffered, has benefited from what, a 3,000% increase in living standards, according to Deirdre McCluskey's Great Enrichment Theory. And yet there has not been 1 year in the intervening 2 centuries when that statement would not have been true. Free trade is always unpopular, but it always works. This is why what in the end convinces people is not theory, but practice. After the Smoot-Hawley tariff, people understood, they could see, even if they didn't get the arguments for it, that protectionism made everybody poorer, especially the people it was most designed to protect, the people on lower incomes. I have a horrible feeling that we're about to go through that learning process again.